At the heart of the Sorb project is a long-term vision, one where the South Oropouche River Basin becomes safer, more resilient to climate change, and a place where both people and nature can thrive. We're not just trying to reduce flooding, we're working toward fewer disruptions to daily life, stronger institutions that can lead local adaptation efforts, and more equitable support for those who are often most affected, like small farmers, fishers, and marginalized groups. Our mission reflects this by focusing on practical, sustainable, and inclusive measures that build resilience across the entire basin. This includes addressing both flood risk and water security, two issues that are closely connected and growing more urgent under climate change. To get there, our goals are clear. We want to reduce flood damage using both infrastructure and nature-based solutions, improve how water resources are managed, protect the ecosystems that support biodiversity and livelihoods, and most importantly, empower communities to actively participate in the solutions, building a future where adaptation is proactive, community-driven, and rooted in environmental and social justice. To bring this vision to life, the Sorb project is built around 5 key components that tackle different aspects of climate resilience in the basin. First, we are strengthening territorial use planning and risk management. Second, we're investing in green and grey infrastructure. Third, we are enhancing coastal and wetland ecosystems. Fourth, we're supporting vulnerable groups such as farmers and fishers. And finally, we're building local capacity and raising awareness so communities can respond to climate risk effectively. Together, these components form a comprehensive, community-driven approach to resilience. So component 5 of the Sorb project is all about building the human and institutional capacity needed to make climate resilience a lasting reality in the South Oropouche River Basin. While infrastructure and ecosystem restoration are critical, we also need to strengthen the ability of local and national institutions to understand, manage, and respond to climate-related risk. And today's workshop is a part of this broader effort, an example of how we are supporting the institutionalization of climate resilience by investing in people, skills, and shared knowledge. The workshop is designed to build practical knowledge and capacity around environmental and social safeguards, key principles that help ensure projects like Sorb are both environmentally responsible and socially inclusive. By the end of today, participants should have a stronger understanding of how to apply these safeguards in a real-world context, how to integrate gender equity into planning and implementation, and how to manage stakeholder concerns through effective grievance redress mechanisms. Ultimately, the goal is to strengthen the institutional ability to not just identify risks, but to actively manage and monitor them, creating a more responsive, transparent, and inclusive approach to climate adaptation. So whether you're coming from a national agency, local government, or supporting institution, your role is critical. And today is about giving you the tools and knowledge to support that role even more effectively. Today's workshop is divided into 4 main parts. We'll begin with an introduction to environmental and social safeguards, what they are, why they matter, and their many uses. Next, we'll have a special guest presentation from the Environmental Management Authority, who will walk us through the process of obtaining a certificate of environmental clearance. We'll then explore how ESS is implemented in practice, followed by a session on grievance redress response mechanisms, where we will look at how institutions can effectively respond to community concerns. Each part is designed to build practical knowledge that you can apply directly into your work. So we'll now move into the first section where we'll explore environmental and social safeguards. Let's take a moment to understand why environmental and social safeguards are so important. First, ESS helps promote inclusion. It ensures that everyone, especially those most vulnerable, to climate impacts has a seat at the table and a voice in decision making. Second, ESS enables voice and justice by providing accessible and fair channels for people to raise concerns and have those concerns addressed effectively. Third, it's about preventing harm. ESS makes sure that projects like Sorb do not unintentionally damage the environment, local communities, or vulnerable groups. And finally, ESS helps ensure compliance with national laws and regulations. This includes processes such as securing certificates of environmental clearance, which we'll hear more about shortly, as well as meeting all permitting requirements, helping to keep the project both legally sound and environmentally responsible. Together, these safeguards form a critical foundation for projects that are not only effective, but are also ethical and inclusive. Let's look at a real example from the South Oropouche River Basin project to see how these principles work in practice. In the Sorb region, floods disrupt daily life and threaten livelihoods, especially for farmers and fishers. One way the project addresses this is through environmental and social safeguards, making sure that local communities are actively involved in planning flood control infrastructure. This means that these groups aren't just simply passive recipients of change, but they have a real say in how solutions are designed to protect their homes and livelihoods. By empowering communities to participate, the project promotes ownership and ensures that interventions are better tailored to the local needs and realities. Let's look at the core principles that guide ESS. The Adaptation Fund and the Sorb project follows a comprehensive set of 15 principles designed to ensure responsible and inclusive project implementation. While we won't go through all of them now, this slide shows 10 of these principles, including Indigenous peoples' rights, core labor rights, and compliance with law. On the next slide, we will see the other 5. So on this slide, we'll see the other 5 and take a closer look at 2 of them. First is access and equity. This means we're making sure everyone, especially marginalized groups, can fairly benefit from the project without worsening existing social and economic inequalities. For example, community-based ecotourism activities in the Guarino Swamp are designed to be inclusive, actively involving women and marginalized fishers. This approach helps ensure the project's benefits reach those who need them the most, promoting fairness and social inclusion. Another key principle is addressing climate change by avoiding actions that worsen its effects and instead promoting adaptation and resilience. For instance, the Sorb project is upgrading flood management infrastructure in vulnerable areas. This helps communities better cope with extreme weather and reduces their overall climate risks. By focusing on adaptive solutions like these, the project supports long-term resilience against climate impacts. Moving on, let's look at the key uses of environmental and social safeguards and how they play a vital role throughout the life of a project by guiding risk management and decision-making. Firstly, ESS helps us to identify potential environmental, social, and gender-related risks early and minimize negative impacts. It also ensures fair, inclusive decision-making by making sure vulnerable communities have a voice and can benefit following us to plan ahead on the project. Additionally, ESS promotes sustainable development by encouraging environmentally responsible and social equitable practices. And finally, these safeguards strengthen accountability and transparency by setting up clear monitoring and reporting processes, keeping projects accountable to stakeholders and regulatory bodies. Together, these uses help ensure projects are effective, responsible, and equitable. So this diagram shows how environmental factors are closely connected to social and human well-being. For example, when people swim in the ocean, chemicals from sunscreen can wash off into the water. These toxic substances disrupt ecological functions by altering behavior and feeding patterns of marine organisms. These disruptions can then cascade through the ecosystem, ultimately affecting fisheries and communities dependent on marine resources. Similarly, nutrients and sediments from agricultural runoff enter soil and waterways. This runoff can harm both aquatic organisms and degrade water quality, which impacts the health of both ecosystems and communities relying on them. These examples demonstrate environmental changes have direct effects on people's lives, especially those who are dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods. So let's look at an example of how these environmental and social linkages come together in practice. In the Sorb project, ESS helps ensure that flood management strategies don't just reduce flood risk, but they also protect local agriculture, improve access to water, and include input from community members like farmers and fishers. By taking this kind of holistic approach, the project delivers both environmental protection and real social benefits. Now that we've looked at how environmental and social safeguards can be used throughout a project, let's look at the kind of impacts they can have when effectively applied. First, they promote environmental protection by encouraging sustainable practices that preserve biodiversity and natural resources, like the flood management measures in the Sorb project that support long-term environmental health. They also help ensure social inclusion by involving marginalized groups such as small-scale farmers and fishers in decision-making processes. This reduces inequality and empowers communities. ESS strengthens climate change resilience, for example, through green infrastructure and ecosystem restoration, helping communities better adapt to climate-related risks. They also uphold human rights and justice by providing fair, accessible grievance mechanisms so affected individuals can raise concerns and seek redress. In addition, ESS supports economic and project sustainability by balancing social, environmental, and economic priorities to ensure long-lasting positive outcomes. And finally, they help ensure legal compliance, aligning projects with national laws and international standards to reduce risks and maintain accountability. To continue this section, I'd like to welcome a special guest from the Environmental Management Authority. Mr. Mario Manuel will now guide us through understanding the process of obtaining a certificate of environmental clearance.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us and giving us this opportunity to present and speak about the process of obtaining a certificate of environmental clearance, right? So therefore, let's get straight into it. Okay, so basically, we're going to walk you through the process of understanding what the EMA does and the certificate of environmental clearance process, right? So firstly, the presentation will talk about the roles and functions of the EMA, the Guiding Environmental Management Act and subsidiary legislation, the certificate of environmental clearance process and the environmental impact assessment. We will touch on our national register, and at the end, we'll have a question and answer session, right? Now, in terms of what the EMA does, it's about finding that balance between the needs of the environment and development. Now, in terms of our role, we enshrined in our act, we coordinate, we educate, and we also the regulator. Now, as the regulator, we write environmental standards, laws, and regulations, right? We do permits through our different processes, which we will discuss later. So we write, we implement rules, we enforce them, and we also monitor them. Now, our primary legislation, the Environmental Management Act, Chapter 3505, enshrines that we coordinate, facilitate, and oversee environmental and national environmental strategies and programs to promote public awareness of environmental concerns and to establish an effective regulatory regime, right? So this links back to what we had said before in terms of coordination, education, and regulation. The EMAC is the umbrella legislation under which all our subsidiary legislation falls. We have our noise pollution control rules. We have the water pollution rules. We have the CEC rules, Certificate of Environmental Clearance rules. We have the environmental species rules, which covers animals such as leatherback turtles, everybody is familiar with, right? We have environmentally sensitive area rules. Examples are like the Nerva swamp, the Matura environmentally sensitive area, right? We have our air pollution rules, and we have the waste management rules. Now, the legislative framework for the CEC process, so as would have been shown before on the previous slide, the Environmental Management Act is at the top. Section 6 of the EM Act establishes the EMA. Section 35 of the Act stipulates the need for a CEC mechanism. Now, under the CEC rules, we have the Certificate of Environmental Clearance Designated Activities Order 2001. This is a list of activities that basically describes the activities that require a certificate of environmental clearance. And then we have our certificate of environmental clearance fees and regulations, right, which basically lays out the fees for the process, which we'll discuss later. Now, Section 62F of the EM Act mandates a person to apply and obtain a certificate of environmental clearance, right? So, and also, when a CEC is issued, to comply with its conditions and the mitigation measures any certificate EMA issues. Now, the purpose of the process, it goes back to the core of it is determination and assessment of the potential environmental impacts that may come out of any kind of project, whether it's new, a modified one, expanded, a facility or something that has to be decommissioned or abandoned. It incorporates also the ancillary works that may fall within the scope of the activity, right? So the scope of the activity is outlined in the prescribed list of listed activities. So the description of the project, right, as it aligns with what is described in the designated activities order. So the key points to note is that the idea is that promotion of sustainable development, and this also facilitate decision making that concerns environmental and social impacts. Environmental management is a tool to ensure environmental consequences are considered in the development planning and decision making in Trinidad and Tobago. So it's integral to these things. Impacts of projects that are considered under this process. We look at water quality, surface water, groundwater, marine, coastal, air quality, air emissions, things like dust, fumes, emissions, or any kind of project activity. Impacts on flora and fauna, the biological environment. And then from any project, also waste management and disposal. So what the kind of waste that are generated, what are the plans to dispose of those, right? And how waste is generally going to be managed. So the question everybody asks is like a common frequently asked question is, when is a CC required? So it's important to note that CC is required prior to the activity, right? So as you'll see, if you look at the activities order in detail, so establishment, modification, expansion, decommissioning, or abandonment of any particular project, right? And for it to require a CC, the description of that project must fall within the description and the scope of what is listed and described in the designated activities order. Now, the CC designated order lists 44 designated activities for which a CC is required. It covers development in many different spheres of natural environment. So onshore projects, coastal, nearshore, offshore developments. It encompasses both non-energy related and energy related developments, and many different aspects of our economy and economic sectors. Now, so that's an example of some of the designated activities. So we have designated activity 13, which covers basically coastal or offshore construction, modification, and dredging activities. So part A, so establishing, modification, expansion, decommissioning, abandonment. So these are marinas, piers, slipways, jetties, other coastal features. The photos that we have up basically is at the shores of Peace. It shows a stone revetment that was built for protection of the coastline at that point, right? 13 also covers things offshore, things like artificial reefs or other offshore structures. And Part C, dredging or cutting of coastal marine areas. So dredging in terms of what needs to be done for things like marinas, for ports, and things of that nature. Another example is for water resources, right? So it also covers catchment, extraction, and treatment of potable or processed water. Something that really falls under the ambit of WASA. WASA is the main entity in terms of doing that. However, also farmers and other persons and other types of projects also do things like put on wells and abstract water, right? So this basically covers facilities for catchment abstraction. It also deals with water wells and other infrastructure, right? So abstraction withdrawals from water courses for agriculture, treatment for your potable water supply. All right, next slide, please. Another example, rivers and drainage, activity 41, establishment land drainage and irrigation schemes. So this will cover land drainage or irrigation schemes for passive lands of 1 hectare during a 2-year period. This could deal with agriculture in terms of irrigation. It also covers and encompasses land development, residential development, commercial development, right? Where drainage has to be put down to deal with the stormwater coming off of that development. It also deals with flood control systems, water supply, dams, realignment or modification of drainage river systems, right? So things that could be implemented deal with flooding. So whether it's water course diversions, widening, the building of levees and dikes, the building of floodgates, the building of ponds, dams, and structures to retain water when rain falls, right? And things of that nature. Right. So in terms of submitting a CC application, so we have basically a new system and process to submit applications. All applications are to be completed and submitted via our new EMA customer portal. So what this means is that we no longer do hard copies to be dropped off at town country planning division, right, as would have been done before. And no more sending of application attachments to the CC email address. So this portal facilitates payment, right, using ePay. It accepts debit and Visa and credit card payments. All attachments are to be uploaded in the portal, and everything you need to know in terms of how to apply any kind of information as required. You can use the user guide for the portal, and our FAQs are there, right? So the point of the process is to align with less use of resources. It is now paperless and uses like less cash, right? So what have happened before is that when the EMA received the application, everything was in 3 copies. So triplicate in terms of the amount of paper that we would use just to receive and process these applications, right? So save paper, we have saved resources. Now, in terms of the fees and charges, a CC application basically costs $500 to apply, right? That's the basic fee. If an EIA is required, right, as the fees and regulations laid out in the legislation, such legislation mandates, for EIA, the fees are basically laid out per activity in the designated activities order, and they range from 5,000 to as much as 600,000, right? So, and all payments that are made through the EMA's Republic Bank Limited account that we have up on the slide. Now, the type of information required for CC application, we'd have touched on the project description before. The project description is needed and is required to compare whatever that project is in comparison to designated activities, the 44 that the EMA has. So the project will be compared to see which designated activities are applicable in terms of that activity. We require, addition to the description of the project, scope of works, right? Which is basically a description of all the works entailed in the project. So from your site preparation, construction, right? What happens and how long it takes. So how long each of these things and steps takes, right? And then it could go over into your post-construction and operational phase, the elements that are part of the project, what you expect to happen and when you expect it to happen. In every CC application, right? Now, these things listed are also enshrined in the Act in terms of the kind of information required for a CC application. So we need to know where the project is going to happen, right? And so that's its location. And also, for particular types of project where you have a proposed layout, what are the elements and components of that site in terms of how things are in relation to each other and for the surrounding environment. So taking account of where boundaries are, where the neighbors are, what are the natural features, is there any drainage, are there roads, are there rivers, right? And then for the components on the site, how are they organized relative to each other? What's the setback distance from the boundaries? Show the main elements that may generate emissions, such as air emissions, produce pollutants to discharge to water courses and things of that nature. We require a description of the environment. This changes based on the scale and level of the project, but basically what we want to know is the site conditions and a description of what the baseline environment is. So for let's say a typical site in a built-up area, you'd have to describe what the area is like. Do you have neighbors? In terms of like stakeholders, drainage, rivers, these kinds of elements. For every project, you'd have to describe what are the potential impacts arising out of the proposed project. And this is to be taken into account from, if you look at your scope of works, from site prep through construction, right through to operation, if there's an operational phase, right? What are the potential impacts that will be generated at each of these steps of the project? Impacts to whether it's to water, whether it's riverine, marine, to air, right? Air quality. Is it a noise generating activity? Does it produce waste? What type of waste, hazardous, non-hazardous, right? What the quantities of waste, right? And you assess these impacts, right? Now related to your impacts, you have to have mitigation measures and management plans for all these impacts the project will generate, right? And last but not least, one of the most important parts of our process is that you must do some sort of public notification and engage your neighboring and surrounding stakeholders, right? But I must reiterate, mention also that aside from the CEC process, I have to focus on the importance of also, for every project, obtaining the other relevant approvals. So whether the project requires town country planning division permission, drainage division permission for works in water courses and alterations. So what I'd like everybody to take away from this is that the issuance of a CEC does not grant the right to begin work without getting the other necessary approvals. So you need to have all the approvals in place for a project to go ahead. And when you come back to public notification and engagement, stakeholders are not only neighbors, stakeholders will also be dependent on the project. You have your governmental stakeholders, you have your regulatory agencies, you have NGOs and communities and things like that to consider. All right. So sorry, before going to the slide, one other thing I mentioned. So in terms of knowing what is required for CC application, we have a facility via pre-application meetings for persons to contact us and gain advice to whatever the specific project requires and the type of information required for the EMA to make a determination on the application. So even before application is submitted, you have that facility to start understanding what you would need, right, in terms of the information or data you need to have and the elements that we need to have in front of us for us to properly consider the application, understand the potential impacts, and understand the proposed mitigation measures proposed and the management plans, right? So we go on to the next slide. Now, in terms of the CC application and the outcomes, now as enshrined in our rules, there are several determinations that could be made. Now, the determination of the CEC is also related back to the designated activity. So if based on the project description, there's no relevant designated activity, then a CEC will not be required for the activity. If it falls under one of the designated activities, a CEC will be required. And the end of the process, a CEC will be issued with specific conditions for the conduct of the activity. Now, the CEC in terms of the conditions, there are different parts to bear in mind. There are some general things in terms of submissions of whatever monitoring and reports are required and notification to the EMA. There are aspects that are included under different aspects of the environment, whether it's water, noise, air, waste management. Another determination the EMA can make, a CEC can be required, but a CEC required, but along the process, a EIA will be required, right? And again, at the end of that process, CEC issues specific conditions for conduct of the activity. Coming across the arrow to the right, another outcome is a notice of refusal and NR issued with reasons for refusal, right? I don't want to go too much detail into refusals, but generally is the outcome of a legal process or not meeting or some legal requirement or some sort of violation. For every application, there's the right of appeal, right? There's the right of appeal and the final, for the final decision and appeal, the EMA is to the Environmental Commission. So all appeals in terms of what the EMA would have decided in applications, the place to appeal is at the Environmental Commission. Right. Now, in terms of our process, we have a power process flowchart. This is also available on our website in terms of understanding the process, and it is linked to the page with the portal and all the information in CEC process. So it has some elements that we touched on the previous slides. Application fee for first submission, $500. every application goes through a screening process before it's accepted for processing, right? Once that's complete and we accept it, we basically acknowledge the application within 10 working days. The first 10 working days, the EMA endeavors to do a site visit with the acknowledgement. If based on the information submitted to the application, further information is required, that will also be issued within that 10 working day period, right? So there are two pathways basically here. So there's the pathway where the CEC is required, and there's a pathway where no CEC is required. So in terms of a CEC being required and no EIA is a simpler process, right? So the timelines here are the timelines enshrined in legislation that the EMA has to adhere to. So it's our statutory timelines. So further information goes out to an applicant, right? The applicant gets back to us to submit further information, right? Within 30 working days, the EMA will review that information and get back to the applicant, right? In terms of what is required. So whether based on what was submitted, clarification, or there's some new issue that comes up in what was submitted, and we need to ask additional questions, right? The process will go on until the applicant submits, and then you have that 30 working day period comes into play again. But in essence, at the end of this process, once the information is received and everything that we outlined has been submitted, we can move towards making a determination decision on the application. Then we move to the last box on the bottom in terms of notification of the determination, right? The EIA process on the right-hand side is a much longer process. So when notification of a EIA being required is issued, we have 21 working days in terms of getting that draft terms of reference out, letting the applicant know what is the fee required, right? After that step, there is a 20 calendar day period where towards the finalization of the terms of reference, right? So in that period, the applicant could request for modifications in terms of reference. There's also a facility at that point to engage stakeholders and obtain feedback in terms of the makeup of the terms of reference, right? To consider whether all the considerations are there in terms of what the is necessary to properly evaluate the project. So all the project elements are there, right? And all environmental requirements and things to assess are there to be considered, right? So going through the process, when EIA is submitted, in terms of review and assessment, it's basically an 80 working day period, right? And based on whether the EIA has been done according to terms of reference, that is assessed and evaluated. Usually it's a team, not only from the EMA, but from different organizations. So there's a review team that is formed that basically goes through the EIA and looks at it in relation to the terms of reference with a view that all the things that are required were assessed and done properly, right? So going back to the other side before, at the end of this process, a CEC can be issued, right? So that's one of the outcomes. Now I'd like to move on to one more slide following. Sorry, right. So now the EIA basically, I would have touched on it, is a tool used to identify and assess in terms of a project, its environmental impacts, its socio-cultural impacts, like prior to a decision being made for a project to go forward. Now, I know you'll be thinking like, so when is an EIA required and how is this decided? Now, it is based on the nature, scale, and location and scope of a project, right? So things that is to consider. So type of project it is it large or small? location. So is it close to environmentally sensitive area? Does it impact a greenfield site? Does it impact environmentally sensitive species? These are the questions that have to be asked. Now, these decisions are made on a case-by-case basis, and it's dependent on the type of project and where it is. Now, the things that are considered in EIA, so public consultation and stakeholder engagement, right? And with this, you need some mechanism for stakeholders who may have issues with the project. You need to have a grievance redress plan for that feedback from stakeholders to the project proponents. Every EIA must have within it the legislative and regulatory framework that guides it. Now, not only the EMA's rules, but also the other legislation that that project basically falls under. So whether it's town country planning, whether it has to do with drainage, whether it touches on the Forest Acts or other acts, right? Those things have to be incorporated. You need a robust description of the proposed project and all its elements and components. Based on that, all the significant environmental impacts, right, must be analyzed, discussed in detail, right, and ranked, assessed, and rated. For every EIA, you need a description of environment and baseline conditions. So you need those baseline data and conditions to compare, to look at what obtained before a project existed, right? And then to compare it in terms of mitigation and monitoring and what happens after. So if you look at something like a watercourse or river, right, and you collect the data, you know what is the water quality, and then a project is going to emit or discharge to that watercourse, right? The monitoring that will come after, you're able to compare to the baseline to see what impact it has had, or whether your mitigation measures or the engineering controls you'd have planned are actually working. Now, before I move on to from the EIA, also, so again, the EIA considers impacts throughout the construction phase, operational phase. Impacts are not only negative, it's both positive and negative impacts. With impacts as well, you have to have a mind on the cumulative impacts. Other existing projects, things that already exist in the surrounding environment, things that are planned in the future, right? Can have to a degree, right? Can either magnify some of those impacts, right? When you put them together. So in terms of natural environment, again, air quality, noise, impacts on biodiversity, flora, fauna, I mentioned water quality, and I mean, we can't forget impacts also the sociological side, right? So impacts on the human environment, impacts on demography, economic, social impacts, demand for resources, whether it's electricity, water, health services, impacts on aesthetics, right? Now, in terms of the stakeholder like engagement, the terms of reference will outline that when a stakeholder engagement is done in an environmental impact assessment, a report must be generated, right? And it must detail how that process was done, so that not only EMA, because these things also go out for public viewing as well, right? There is a public period of public view where the public could submit comments about the project, right? Which was taken into consideration. So the manner in which the stakeholder process is conducted, all the stakeholders identified, targeted, neighboring communities, receptors, government agencies, NGOs, how outreach was done in focus groups, they did public meetings, they did flyers, lodging and posting information, you know, what form that would have taken, right? And then the information that was shared, the anticipated impacts, the risks, the mitigation measures, back to meetings, like how many were held, what kind of comments were received, feedback was received, And then was the plan to continue to engage stakeholders like during that project life cycle? And then with the stakeholder engagement, as I mentioned before, how are you going to address grievances? So what's the mechanism for addressing any external grievances to the community as part of that stakeholder engagement? Right, so next slide. Now, grievance redress as part of stakeholder engagement, essentially, complaint is received, you notify the complainant to receive, you determines if the complaint will be processed, you review issues, you notify complainant case status, you request additional information if it's required, you look at your solutions, the timelines proposed, things on the project team, project implemented. So basically, the process allows stakeholders to communicate concerns and complaints about the project consultation process. It should be at all times transparent, fair. It should be equitable, right? For addressing these grievances. And the main purpose is that feedback to decision making and project management for those who are doing these projects. It's supposed to provide a mechanism for like timely resolution of issues, and you really want to prevent escalation of issues into conflict, right, and animosity. It should provide a mechanism for like accountability and for persons to seek remedy, right? And I mean, with transparency being fair, like you're removing that kind of fear of like retribution or persons targeting persons, right? So it's vital to projects monitoring and evaluation process, and it's also vital to for those who are doing projects for learning. Right. So for every certificate issued, there are monitoring conditions that must be upheld by the holder of that CEC, right? So in cases where, or in circumstances where environmental monitoring is required, whether it's the air, water, noise, right? So those monitoring reports must be submitted in accordance with the frequency stipulated in the issued CEC, right? And then the EMA also conducts site visits and follows up in terms of compliance with the CEC, right? So things to note that we welcome joint site visits with other agencies when they're required. When complaints come up, complaints can also trigger more intensive monitoring, right? Now, the National Register basically is a public record of all applications received from not only the CC rules and process, but all the legislation basically implemented by the EMA. So applications received under water, waste, air, and noise pollution control rules, right? The register is located at the EMA library at our office at 80 Elizabeth Street in St. Clair. In order to access it, you contact the EMA to book an appointment, right? And in cases where you have your information, you want to know details about a particular project, if you have information on the applicant, the application, the company, or the type of project, right? It will be very helpful in narrowing down exactly what you're looking for. Right now, in terms of information, the EMA has other information, all our processes on our website. We also on social media, right? There is a nice video about the role of the EMA on YouTube. We have information on Facebook, Instagram, and X.